Welcome back. Well, it just doesn't seem to end. I thought I was going to have a slow weekend, but apparently not. And you see, this news is fairly recent, so we have to get on it and get it out there while it's hot on the table. Now, today we're talking about, among other things, JW.org, Mormons, and child sex cover-ups. And this is actually quite an interesting article, because it really shows what's happening out in the news. And if a lot of you know Mark O'Donnell, he's going to be in this. We're going to be listening in to a radio broadcast regarding this subject. So let's get right into it. Here we are. Here's the article. It is entitled How Child Abuse Goes Unchecked for Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. Michelle Harvin, looks like, put this on. And this is a view of the temple. I guess they didn't want to show the Watchtower headquarters, but this is a temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with its 6 spires in the Kensington, Maryland, near Washington. So that's what this is. And the other guys that we're talking about today, they're right in front of me. They're right over there and right over there. And these are the 9 members of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. And these guys are the ones that control what's going on within their religion. So they're the ones that we hold guilty. We don't necessarily look at Jehovah's Witnesses because they're just people that are confused and that are under the illusion of these 9 men right here. So we're going to get back to the article here, and we're going to take a look at what they have to say. Okay, so a reckoning is taken place in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Jehovah's Witnesses as stories emerge of child sex abuse. Years ago, outrage erupted over how the Catholic Church allowed such abuse to go unchecked, but fewer may be aware of how other faiths are covering up abuse in their ranks. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons, and Jehovah's Witnesses are reportedly making use of the legal exemption for clergy, which allows abuse to go unreported. And the exemption dictates that religious members who hear about abuse through confession are not required to report it to authorities. Recently, newly released recordings revealed the lengths of the Mormons church will go to cover up abuse and assault. And those recordings are part of a case involved Chelsea Goodrich, who grew up in the Mormon church. Her father was a bishop and began abusing her at the age of 2. We hear her story and former Jehovah's Witnesses turned advocate. And we also highlight the latest reporting from Al Jarezi's Fault Liners documentary, Secrets of the Clergy. And we reached out to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for statements for this program, but did not hear back. We also contacted the United States branch of Jehovah's Witnesses, and below is a statement that we received in full. So this is kind of, they don't usually do that. Let's see what they say. So here's what Jehovah's Witnesses say. They say Jehovah's Witnesses view children as a sacred trust from God. Protecting children is of the utmost concern and importance to all Jehovah's Witnesses, and we treat children in a way that makes them feel safe and genuinely loved. Since the 1980s, our religion has provided countless articles and videos and other materials to parents to equip them to identify the signs of abuse and maintain open lines of communication with their children and help their children to defend themselves against any who might seek to do them harm. You see, this is what they do. They throw this back on the parents, but the parents are handcuffed and shackled. If they report this to the police, they're going to be dealt with differently in the congregation. They view that as bringing bad light on Jehovah's name. That's kind of how they write that off. So anyways, back to the Jehovah's Witness little letter here. Jehovah's Witness abhor child abuse and view it as a crime. Do they really? Well, don't you see, if someone breaks into a Kingdom Hall, they report it to the police right away. But if someone molests some little girl, they cover it up. It's a crime. These guys just twist it. In all cases, victims and their parents, if minors, have the right to report of accusation child abuse to authorities. Now they've made that a lot clearer in their most recent elders book. But a lot of these cases go back, folks, 10, 12, 20, 30 years. The old elders book allowed those elders to do whatever they wanted, and they know they have a liability. They just changed this recently in their elders book. Now, they're saying, therefore, victims, their parents, or anyone else who reports such accusations to the elders of our religion are clearly informed by the elders, and they have the right to report the matter to the authorities. Elders do not criticize anyone who makes to choose a report. You see, now, no, they're speaking correct. But you see, these abuse cases go way back, and their elders books allowed it. So we gave a lot of parts on elders books. I'll try to pin some at the end of this video. They go on to say if an alleged abuser is one of Jehovah's Witnesses, elders conduct a scriptural investigation. This is purely religious proceeding handled by elders according to the scriptural instructions, limited to the issue of the alleged abuser standing as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. A congregant who is an unrepentant perpetrator of the child abuse is expelled from the congregation is no longer considered one of Jehovah's Witnesses. The elders handling the accusation of child abuse as a serious sin is not a replacement for the authorities. They handling the matter as a crime. This is right out of their elders book. Their recent elders book. You see, in their recent elders book, they made a whole chapter, chapter 14, under child abuse. In their old elders book, it had one or two little things. They classified, they just threw it in with some other stuff. And we show that on this channel. We break their elders books down. So, okay. Elders provide spiritual support and comfort to those who request it. Now, we broke that down. They don't. Right in their elders book, it says if they make too many visits, then assign an older sister or someone to it. You see, they don't assign outside counselors to help the abused victim. There's none of that. Jehovah's Witnesses do not pay for a counselor to come in and help these victims, but yet they're hiring the Catholic Church's lawyer, Matt Haverstick, to handle their cases in Pennsylvania. And they're paying this guy thousands of dollars an hour. But yet they won't help the victims. In the elders book, there's no help to the victims except assign some older sister. So, you see, Jehovah's Witnesses, the organization, has to have family counseling, outside family counseling, to help these victims. Now, they go on to say elders provide spiritual support and comfort to those who request it. That's a lie. They strive to treat victims of child abuse with compassion. No, they don't. Understanding. No, they don't. I brought my child in before elders, and they are bullies. I tried to get my medical physician to come in. They wouldn't allow him to come in because my medical physician was not a Jehovah's Witness. These guys are bullies, and this is a complete lie letter. That's how they do it. Victims and their families may decide to consult mental health professionals. You see, what about all the cases where they assign some ministerial servant or someone and they have sex with someone? They assign a ministerial servant kid, 23-year-old kid, to go into a family's home to help them, and he has sex with a minor. What are they going to do about that? You see, these cases are all getting exposed. We're going to go in. Let's listen to Mark O'Donnell. Let's listen to this broadcast here. I'm going to get off the screen for a bit and tune this in here. Okay, here we go.
This is 1A. I'm Jen White. A reckoning is taking place in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Jehovah's Witnesses as more stories emerge of child sex abuse. Years ago, outrage erupted over how the Catholic Church allowed abuse to go unchecked, but fewer may be aware of how other faiths are covering up abuse in their ranks. Before we continue, we will hear from survivors of child sex abuse this hour. If you need to step away from the conversation, you can find it later at the1a.org. And if you need help, you can call the National Sexual Assault Hotline. You'll be connected to a trained staff member at a sexual assault service provider in your area. Call 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673. Today, we look at two communities in particular, Jehovah's Witnesses and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we heard from some of you about your experience.
My name is Yvette, and I grew up a Jehovah's Witness. There are no guardrails for how sharp and how physical the abuse can be, and it's not across the board. It's just the parents that choose to do so have complete immunity from anything if they're very severely punishing their kids.
My name is Hope, and I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah. One of the ways that I witnessed the perpetuation of sexual exploitation in the Mormon church when I was involved in it as a kid was the normalization of sexual conversation taking place between a bishop and a either teenager or kid in the bishop room.
We want to hear from you too. If you grew up Mormon or as a Jehovah's Witness or in another faith tradition, how do you feel your congregation protects children in your church? Email us at 1a@wamu.org. Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, make use of a legal exemption for clergy which allows abuse to go unreported to police. Over 30 states allow for this exemption, which means religious members who hear about abuse in a confessional setting are not required to report it to authorities. Newly released recordings reveal the lengths the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has gone to cover up child sex abuse.
We both agree that we will not disclose that we've settled with you, and you will not disclose that you've settled with the church, other than your attorney or financial advisors, and they must maintain confidentiality as well.
Okay.
Second paragraph, I'll be interested in your response, but the recommendation is that you acknowledge that there's been some recordings made of all of our communications, and that you agree to destroy those recordings within 10 days of signing this.
Those recordings obtained by the Associated Press are part of a case involving Chelsea Goodrich. She grew up in the Mormon church where her father was a bishop. He began abusing her at the age of 2. Her story reveals how the church protected her father. Chelsea is now a mental health counselor, and she joins me from Idaho to talk about her experience. Chelsea, welcome to the program.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
So as I said, your father was a bishop in the Mormon church. He began abusing you at a very early age, and it wasn't until your late 20s when it all came to light. What happened?
Yeah, I was a very sheltered child and adult in many ways, which I imagine many of the listeners that come from a devout Mormon background or otherwise devout religious background can relate to and understand. I was also partly homeschooled, and so I do think that these are reasons why it took me longer to put the pieces together of my abuse. But yes, beginning in my mid to late 20s, I started to have a lot of experiences where I realized that I couldn't really date. I couldn't get close to a man, even though I wanted to. I would have panic attacks and become very ill when we would discuss, having a more serious relationship, whoever I was dating. And just the thought of being intimate with someone, for me, triggered feelings that I would be trapped and forced to do something against my will. And at that time, it didn't make logical sense, but I started to really revisit memories from my childhood and with my father, and that's when I started putting the pieces together.
Now, your father confessed to the church. How aware were you and your family about the clergy exemption that did not mandate the bishop divulge your father's confession?
I wasn't. I really wasn't aware that there was legal protections. I mean, frankly, I've come to learn that in a way they're rather loose legal protections, and that a clergyman confessed to really can divulge that information with less legal repercussions than you would think. This is what I'm coming to learn from discussions with attorneys. But the LDS Church, and apparently some other churches, rest very, very heavily on these supposed strong legal protections for the clergy that are confessed, that confessions of child sexual abuse are made to. And it's really wrong, in my opinion, especially after what I've been through this whole experience.
Now, you spoke with the bishop who heard your father's confession, and he was originally interested in talking to the police. What changed?
Quite simply, what changed was that he followed protocol and he called what is called the helpline, what is known as the helpline for the LDS Church, headquartered outside of Salt Lake City, headquartered in Salt Lake City. And it's basically, the helpline is a bunch of attorneys and I guess social workers that these clergymen can call. They're instructed to call and speak with. And these people coached Bishop Miller what to do. And after that, he completely changed from, for example, his instinct was to report what had been confessed to him, or at least make a report to the police that this man had abused a child. And the helpline attorneys advised him not to. They said that's not necessary. This woman is no longer a minor, and so you don't need to make a report. In addition, his instinct was to be willing to testify as a witness to what had been confessed to him concerning my child sexual abuse. And they advised him against that as well. So, that's really what changed the whole thing.
The church did terminate your father's membership, but did he ever face any legal consequences for his actions? Actions that, as we should again remind people, he confessed to.
Correct, he did. And, he did not end up facing legal repercussions. And I will also add that it took almost 5 months for him to be excommunicated from the time he confessed to the time he was excommunicated, because a leader who was, even higher up over the bishop that he confessed to was friends with him and was frankly trying to prevent his excommunication. And then finally, when Salt Lake City basically mandated that excommunication take place, they just went through the excommunication court as a form of kind of like a formality, because Salt Lake City, once they realized the situation, they were like, well, this man was a former Mormon bishop. My father, he had been a bishop, including during the time that he molested me. And so, in spite of one of the church leaders being a friend of my dad's and trying to prevent his excommunication, Salt Lake City did mandate that. But then the excommunication took place in total secret, which it's not supposed to, as far as the fact that I was supposed to be allowed to be there. I requested to be there. And this higher up church leader, basically, he barred me from that. He prevented that from happening. And so I didn't even know, none of our family knew when my father was excommunicated. And also that excommunication was not announced to the church leaders in the way that is normally done, that is protocol. And so you have to realize that this was being held in particular secrecy, this whole process, which when you think about my father being a pedophile, is really despicable, because the local church members, congregation members, had no way of really knowing that they needed to be protecting their children. Ultimately, I did report my father to the authorities, and initially he was arrested and charged on rape of a minor, incest, and lewd and lascivious conduct, among other things. And the prosecutor was actually really remarkable, the Mountain Home, Idaho prosecutor that I first worked with. She said, I'm going to prosecute your father to the fullest extent of the law. And she said, I've been getting phone calls from your father's criminal defense attorney, but I am not taking those because I'm not open to a plea deal in this case. So It started off well, didn't end well.
Well, let's pause there and pick up your story in just a few moments. We're talking to Chelsea Goodrich. She's a mental health counselor and former member of the Mormon Church. We did reach out to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for this conversation. We did not hear back. If you need help, you can call the National Sexual Assault Hotline. You'll be connected to a trained staff member at a sexual assault service provider in your area. Call 800-656-HOPE. That's 800-656-4673. Coming up, we continue our conversation with Chelsea, and we talk with a former Jehovah's Witness about why he's dedicated his life to advocating for sexual abuse victims. I'm Jen White. This is 1A from WAMU and NPR. I'm Jen White. This is 1A. A reminder that we're hearing from survivors of child sex abuse. If you need to step away from the conversation, you can find it later at the1a.org. Chelsea Goodrich is still with us. She's a mental health counselor and former member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, widely known as Mormons. Chelsea has fought for justice after experiencing sexual abuse at the hands of her father, who was also a bishop. The abuse was covered up by the church using a law that exempts clergy from reporting abuse if obtained in a confessional setting. Chelsea, you said the prosecution of your father started off well, but then your case was transferred to another prosecutor and things took a turn. What happened?
Correct, Jen. So after there was an election, the case was handed to a different prosecutor, and this prosecutor handed the case to actually his assistant prosecutor, who was also his 28-year-old fiance. I mean, think kind of classic small town politics type of situation, but there wasn't many checks and balances. And then unfortunately, also the Mormon Church became involved even more than I realized until later with some conversations with this prosecutor. I don't know exactly all what took place that way, but I do have an email correspondence where an LDS attorney emailed me and said, I spoke with the prosecutor on your case, and she says she doesn't need or want the bishop to testify. And I was really shocked. And so I emailed her and asked her if that was true. And she said, no, I never would have said that I don't need or want the bishop to testify. And then I emailed him, and he said, well, there must have been some kind of misunderstanding. So there was suddenly this involvement from the LDS Church that I still don't really fully comprehend, but I can tell you that they weren't trying to help my situation, and they weren't encouraging the bishop to testify by any means. In fact, my impression was that they had kind of scared him out of doing so. So, eventually the case was dropped. It was actually dismissed with prejudice, which I've since come to learn is very unusual in a child sexual abuse case.
It means that you can't bring the case again.
Correct. And it was all very devastating. I reached out to the Idaho Attorney General's office in, I believe, 2018, both about the case being dropped and what I saw as potential prosecutorial malfeasance on the part of the prosecutor and the assistant prosecutor. And I also was concerned because I felt that my niece was in danger of being molested by my father as she was currently in his home. And the Idaho Attorney General's office, which, mind you, at that time, the Idaho Attorney General, Lawrence Wasden, was active Mormon. And I believe the current Idaho Attorney General is as well. And I reached out for help, and the response that I got was that because that assistant prosecutor was then working for the Attorney General's office, that would be a conflict of interest for them to look into the case or investigate. And so basically, I felt like I was just getting the bird finger in a way from them saying, sorry, like nobody's going to help you here. This is over.
Well, we didn't get a response from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints when we made a request for them to participate in this program. They did respond to the Associated Press's report detailing your story in a tweet. They write, quote, "The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints terminated the perpetrator's membership 8 years ago in October 2015 when it learned of the abuse. He has not been readmitted to church membership. Claims that he confessed to a bishop prior to 2015 are false. His communications with his bishop were protected by Idaho state law. Only the perpetrator could release the bishop from his obligation under the clergy penitent privilege, and he refused to do so. The bishop was subpoenaed to testify in this case, but prosecutors released the subpoena, and he was not recalled to testify. The church has no role in influencing the prosecuting attorney to dismiss the criminal case." So that was their response to the Associated Press report. But Chelsea, what I'm hearing from you are several layers. I'll call them layers to your experience. There's the secrecy you experienced around your abuse, that it was kept quiet, that you didn't feel you had a voice or support in getting justice, but also that there is this law on the books that gives cover to abusers when they confess the abuse in a certain setting. And I wonder how you respond to the way the church has responded to this case and the lack of accountability for your father.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on this, and I'll try to keep it concise, but I've recently had an attorney do a public records request into the Mountain Home, Idaho criminal case that was closed, and he can't find any motions that line up with the church's statement indicating that there was some kind of a retracting or reversing of the subpoena on Bishop Miller to testify. There didn't seem to be any motions for that, even from the defense. And so you have to really wonder what was going on as to why the bishop wasn't encouraged to testify and why the church would state that somehow there was a legal, proceeding for him not testifying. And I think that from my experience so far, I would just plead with the LDS Church and other churches out there to please put their child victims first, to practice transparency and stop being secretive, stop hiding and covering things up, stop asking a victim like myself, a former child victim like myself, to destroy recordings, to do something like destroy recordings that had evidence, the only evidence that I had of my conversations with Bishop Miller, and the fact that he does say on those recordings that he called the helpline, that they told him that what my father had done to me was considered sexual abuse of a child according to the definition of the law, and that that my father was excommunicated, that there was even conversations with the helpline. This was all important evidence of a crime that they were asking me to destroy. And so when the church also states that I was always allowed to tell my story, that's, in my opinion, ridiculous and offensive, because of course I could always talk about the sexual abuse from my father, but when such a key integral part of the story was the fact that he was a Mormon bishop and that church leaders did, I believe, cover this even when I was a child, because my father told us that when he was a bishop, he went and made a confession to a higher up leader of having sexually abused me. And I think that that's frankly a big part of why the church gave us, my mother and myself, the money that they did, because they knew that there were church leaders who knew even earlier than 2015. And all of this was to be covered up by destroying those recordings. And that was really limiting me in being able to tell the truth or even get further criminal justice if I so desired. So, yeah, I would ask the church to not treat sexual abuse victims the way that they appear to have a pattern of doing. I thought my situation was a one-off. I've come to learn that there is a pattern here and that there is systemic issues with the way that the LDS Church deals with sexual predators and the way that they treat the victims of sexual abuse is generally not appropriated. It's not okay. It was not okay in my case. And I would just ask the church to, instead of lobbying to keep the clergy privilege laws on the books like they do, to please use their power and influence to work in the other direction, please.
And briefly, Chelsea, because I'm sure now that you've shared your story, you've heard from others. And especially in your line of work, you've heard people with similar stories to yours. What do you tell them, or what would you tell someone who's listening right now, who's maybe grappling with this issue right now?
Well, honestly, it's hard for me not to get emotional thinking about other survivors. And, you know, we are both victims and survivors. We were victims as children, and as adults, we're survivors seeking to thrive, right? We want to have a complete life again, but that is a battle, an uphill battle for survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And I would just tell those people to remain strong, because even though there may be people in their families, in their churches, who do not see them and do not hear them because of cultural dysfunction, that there are those out there who do see you, who do hear you, who do understand and empathize, and whose hearts are with you, and my heart is with you. And I believe that if we can support each other, that we can get through this together, because we shouldn't have to do it isolated and alone, the way that unfortunately the church and our society often leaves us.
That's Chelsea Goodrich. She's a mental health counselor and former member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Chelsea, we so deeply appreciate you sharing your story with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
Let's bring in our guests for the rest of the conversation. Natasha Del Toro hosts the documentary Confessions, Silence, and Child Abuse, Secrets of the Clergy. It's the latest from Al Jazeera's investigative series Fault Lines, where she's a freelance correspondent. She joins us from Tampa, Florida. Natasha, welcome.
Jen, thank you so much for having me on.
Also with us is Lynn Cadigan, an attorney who's been practicing sex abuse law for 40 years. She joins us from Tucson, Arizona. Lynn, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
And
thank you very much.
And Mark O'Donnell is with us. He was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. He's left the faith and is now an advocate for survivors of abuse in the community. He's also a consultant for attorneys handling abuse cases, and he joins us from Baltimore. Mark, it's great to have you on the program.
Thank you very much, Jen. It's great to be here.
And we're hearing from you as well.
Hi, this is Gail Howard in Connecticut. I'm a volunteer working with victims of clergy sex abuse. I am talking with a former Connecticut legislator who was sexually assaulted by a Greek Orthodox bishop in Fairfield, Connecticut, when he was a child. More recently, he was sexually harassed by another Greek Orthodox bishop. When he complained to Greek Orthodox leadership, they rejected his claims and told him to go away.
Gail, thanks for sharing that message, and we'd love to hear from you as well. If you grew up in the Mormon church or as a Jehovah's Witness or in another faith tradition, do you feel your congregation does enough to protect the children in your church? Why or why not? Send us an email at 1a@wamu.org. Natasha, your documentary follows survivors who dealt with sexual abuse within the Jehovah's Witness church. Let's take a listen.
I don't understand how anyone in their right mind can blatantly ignore the safety of a child, especially within a church that's supposed to be loving and accepting and welcoming and just supposed to take care of its members. But they didn't do that for my family or me at all.
Natasha, I would imagine, listening to Chelsea, it probably sounds very familiar after talking to the survivors in your documentary. What did you learn from talking to these people?
Yeah, actually, and we did talk to survivors of the Mormon, child sex abuse survivors of Mormon church as well. And that particular clip was a young woman that was abused she was in the Mormon church, and she was abused starting at age 5. What I heard from Chelsea's story is similar to the stories I heard from a lot of the former Jehovah's Witnesses that we spoke to who were survivors, and which they're very, very hard stories, and I'm glad that you all are doing an episode on this. There is absolutely a pattern in how the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormon Church and the Catholic Church deals with the predators, how they handle the victims and the allegations, and how they're using this clergy penitent loophole to not report abuse to the police and to shield themselves from legal action. Jehovah's Witnesses in particular, and I know Mark O'Donnell, who's a whistleblower now, he can speak in great depth about the specifics of Jehovah's Witness and the church. Well, they don't call it the church, but their organization, he can speak to those specifics. But one of the things that they do is that they discourage members from speaking out. They'll actually shun people who are brave enough, like Chelsea was. I mean, she was, in the Mormon tradition, but in the Jehovah's Witnesses, they'll shun you if you are brave enough to speak out. One woman that we spoke to, her name was Mariah Hughes. She was in Washington State. She was 14 when an adult man in her congregation started grooming her and sexually abused her for 2 years. He was also abusing another young girl in the same congregation. In a lawsuit that Mariah filed, it was discovered that he had already abused young girls at a former congregation, and the elders of the church were aware of it. But they didn't do anything to protect the children at Mariah's congregation, to protect her.
Well, this gets me to this question of the clergy penitent law, because Lynn, a mandated reporter, this is someone who is legally required to report suspected child abuse, and that typically includes teachers and doctors and mental health professionals. But this clergy penitent law, and it varies state by state, provides this legal cover of sorts. Just explain more clearly how it works.
Well, the clergy privilege exists in Arizona and 32 other states. But what it really is, and there is a myth that you don't have to report and you can't report. And if you make the choice to not report, you'll be in trouble and it's against the law. It is not true. It's a crime to not report, and clergy privilege is a defense to that crime. So, for example, the county attorney in Bisbee was considering charging this bishop with a crime of not reporting, but his defense was, well, it was a confidential communication. So I think it's very important for everyone when they consider what church they want to belong to, what the precepts of their church is, because it's a moral choice that a clergy can make. A clergy can report the crime, can call Child Protective Services, and can protect the child. And it's their moral choice. They won't go to jail, they won't get in trouble. The only thing they might get is maybe a slap on the wrist from their own church.
Let's pause here. We're discussing how allegations of child sex abuse are handled in religious communities. We're talking to Lynn Cadigan, an attorney practicing sex abuse law, Natasha Del Toro, host of the Al Jazeera Fault Lines documentary Confessions, Silence, and Child Abuse, Secrets of the Clergy, and we'll hear from Mark O'Donnell after the break. He's an advocate for survivors of sexual abuse and the Jehovah's Witness organization. I'm Jen White. We'll be back with more in a moment. To our discussion about how the Mormon Church and Jehovah's Witnesses deal with claims of child sex abuse. We're here with Natasha Del Toro, host of the new documentary Confessions, Silence, and Child Abuse, Secrets of the Clergy. It's the latest from Al Jazeera's investigative series Fault Lines, where she's a freelance correspondent. Also with us is Lynn Cadigan, an attorney who's been practicing sex abuse law for 40 years, and Mark O'Donnell. He was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. He's now an advocate for survivors of abuse in the community and a consultant for attorneys handling abuse cases. We're also hearing from you.
This is Pat from Grand Rapids, Michigan, my wife and I, and many, many others, have kind of dropped away from the Catholic Church because of abuse and abuse allegations. One of the answers is have the law be involved early, as opposed to just handing it over to the institution. And I think that's what happened with the Catholic Church.
We also heard from Annie, who emails, "When I was assaulted by a member of the church, I went to the bishop as my father told me I needed to confess my sins of leading on this member. I was only 12. The bishop told me I needed to ask forgiveness and not partake of the sacrament every Sunday until further notice. This meeting was between myself, a 12-year-old girl, and an adult male who was a doctor of pediatric medicine. He was a mandated reporter who did not report the person because the church does not allow that to happen." Mark, you grew up as a Jehovah's Witness. You've left the faith since, but you saw abuse in the church firsthand. When did you began to see this as something you needed to take on to advocate for survivors of abuse?
It was a very long process. It actually began when I was about 13 years old. And, I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness from birth. And within our congregation here in Baltimore, I noticed that there was a pioneer minister, a full-time minister of Jehovah's Witness who had been touching girls inappropriately. At least I thought it was very inappropriate. And I reported this to the elders, and one elder in particular, who was a very prominent elder, instead of investigating this further or contacting the authorities, what he did was actually divulge my confidentiality, and he went to the abuser, he went to this person, and actually told him that I was the one who made these accusations. And as a result, I ended up being pretty severely chastised, very severely chastised by the person who was touching these girls. And honestly, nothing ever came of this until years later when I left the church 10 years ago. I wanted to see what happened to this person who had been touching these girls in a way I thought was very inappropriate. And I was shocked. Well, really, I wasn't shocked, but I discovered that he had been sued by 7 different women who were part of the church, as well as some outside of the church in the massage parlor where he got a job. And 7 different women said that he did exactly the same thing to them, both as minors and as adults. And then I started getting in contact with people from my past that had left the Jehovah's Witnesses and discovered that he too had been sexually molesting them. In fact, just a month ago, I got another call from another person and her sister who I had no idea who they were, but they said, well, I read your story in the Atlantic, and they told exactly the same story. So that was when I was about 13 years old.
In 2022, the independent firm Guidepost Solutions released a previously secret list of hundreds of Southern Baptist Conference church members accused of sexual abuse. Jehovah's Witnesses have been documenting instances of sexual abuse since the late 90s. According to the Atlantic, these records by Jehovah's Witnesses could possibly be the largest database out there of sexual predators. Mark, why doesn't law enforcement have access to these records?
What you've been discussing with your guests, and it's the issue of confidentiality. And it's not just an issue with the Jehovah's Witnesses, obviously with the Mormon Church and the Catholic Church. In fact, with the Catholic Church, of course, their priest will be arrested by the police before they will divulge confidential communication. That's their position, because really what we're dealing with here is First Amendment and constitutional issues. And these churches, especially the Jehovah's Witnesses, what they are saying is that you cannot violate our constitutional authority to keep these matters confidential. It's not just the confessions, but it's any communication that the church declares is confidential, not what the state declares, but it's what the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormon says is confidential. And this is why this is one reason that they want to keep those things under wraps and handle the matters internally.
Lynn, what do you make of that argument that this is a constitutional issue?
Well, it's a very interesting constitutional issue, because the flag that these churches, the Mormon Church in particular, flies is religious freedom. But the Constitution says you can't establish any law that favors one religion over another. what's interesting is in the Mormon and the Catholic Church, children are more in danger because there they claim that everything is confidential and nothing can be revealed. If you were a Lutheran, if you're Jewish, if you're a Baptist, they don't have confession. So they would be obligated to report immediately. And so I think it's an unequal protection and an unequal treatment as far as the different religions. I mean, what if you had and what is even more interesting is this concept of religious freedom. What if a church, the reason they protect this is they want to protect the soul of the penitent, or they want to be able to give counseling to these people. But while they may have the religious freedom to keep this counseling private, what about the freedom of the child to be free from rape? It really doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And the unequal protection among the different religions makes it very unconstitutional, and it turns the Constitution on its head as far as religious freedom and equal protection.
In 2020, the Montana Supreme Court reversed a $35 million ruling against Jehovah's Witnesses for not reporting sexual abuse to authorities. It was reversed, citing the clergy exemption law. Now, there are only 6 states that require clergy to report child abuse if gleaned from confession. They're New Hampshire, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, Texas, and West Virginia. Natasha, what kind of legislative efforts have there been to do away with that exemption in other states?
Well, last year, the Associated Press reported that since the late 80s, there have actually been 130 bills proposed to close this clergy loophole in the states where this loophole exists. Not one of those bills succeeded. So again and again, you'll see efforts to try and make clergy mandatory reporters in some states, but any time that lawmakers try to include this language of closing the clergy loophole, those bills inevitably die on the vine.
Well, let's hear another clip from your investigative series, Fault Lines.
Every single priest I talk to is willing to go to jail over this issue. This is an infringement on our Catholic tradition and our religious traditions.
So that was a clip from your documentary, Natasha, Secrets of the Clergy. And speaking there was Republican Senator Phil Fortunato of Washington State. Explain a little bit more about who's pushing back against these laws.
Yeah, so you do have, the real opposition here is you have the Catholic Church. They're along with the Mormon Church and Jehovah's Witnesses, but really the Catholic Church has this really well-funded lobbying arm and a lot of influence with lawmakers. So when state lawmakers try to change this loophole, the Catholic Church, you see sort of again and again this pattern of them sort of swooping in and killing the bill, whether it's in committee. In Washington State last year, they have some of the weakest laws. They tried to make clergy mandatory reporters, but as soon as they included the language of the bill, you see this again, to try to close the loophole, then that bill died.
We did reach out to the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they sent this statement saying, quote, "Elders do not shield any perpetrator of child abuse from the authorities. Jehovah's Witnesses strive to adhere to all mandatory reporting laws. Any suggestion that Jehovah's Witnesses do otherwise is simply false. Even if the elders have no legal obligation to report an accusation to the authorities, elders report the matter if the victim or another minor is still in danger of abuse," end quote. We also got this email from Keelan, and you can find the full statement from Jehovah's Witnesses on our website, the1a.org. We also got this email from Keelan who says, "I've been a witness my entire life. I'd like to acknowledge that there have been serious missteps in the past, most often on the part of elders and local congregations. Some may view this as conspiratorial to cover up the actions of others, but generally speaking, you have to consider that some people were blindsided and unsure of how to handle these types of situations." Mark, your response to that from Keelan?
Well, I'm still more in shock at what the Jehovah's Witnesses said to you in there. But look, here's the thing. If you notice the language that they use, they say things like, "We never tell anyone not to report." So that's opposite language. What they should be saying is, we advise our church elders to report, especially when a child is in danger. And they don't report. There are some cases we've seen where they have reported. It's extremely rare, and it's only under certain circumstances that Watchtower's branch representatives, their branch organization in different countries, they make that decision. So it's very difficult, and it's very rare for these elders to be held accountable for not reporting. The one exception to that was I was involved with the prosecution in a case in McHenry County, Illinois, where 2 elders failed to report to the police. And this is while the abuse was going on. A 6-year-old girl back in 2006 was being molested by her father multiple times during that year. And what happened was that the girl ultimately told her mother. The mother went to the elders. She's Latino, didn't speak much English at all. So her only recourse was to go to the elders, she felt. And they called Watchtower's legal department, which is just like the hotline that the Mormons call. And that's the Watchtower legal department is usually staffed not by attorneys initially, but just by paralegals or assistants. And they told the elders in McHenry County, Illinois, not to report. So they didn't even disfellowship this man who had admitted to it. So that was his confidentiality. But the issue here was that the wife also went to the elders and told, this is what happened. So she was not confessing anything. So the law says basically that you don't have that confessional privilege if you're not confessing anything. So ultimately, in Illinois, a very unusual ruling came down that we haven't seen yet. These 2 elders were found guilty of a Class A misdemeanor, Michael Pinkeva and Colin Scott. And that was the decision read by the judge in that case. Because they failed to report. If the man had only confessed to the elders, they would not have been charged by the state of Illinois. But because the wife told the elders what her husband was doing to her child, they were found guilty. And so the reason this came about was because after 2006, the man went right back to abusing his daughter for 12 more years, to the point where he was taking her to the Walgreens to get pregnancy tests. It was a horrific case. And she finally went to the police herself. It was not initiated by the Jehovah's Witnesses. So her father was put in prison, and in 2019, charges were filed against those 2 elders. And this is what we'd like to see more of.
And you mentioned the Watchtower. That's the ruling body of the Jehovah's Witnesses. We only have about a minute and a half left here, and it feels like we're just scratching the surface of this. But I'd love to briefly hear from each of you around this question of how difficult of an issue this is to address, because what we're talking about is a misinterpretation, perhaps willful, or a misunderstanding of the law, but also deeply ingrained cultural and religious practices within communities that can be quite insular. What is the path forward, Lynn?
Well, what we tried to do last year is we tried to change the statute to say that there is a duty to report, and you can't hide behind the privilege if it's ongoing, if you have a reasonable suspicion that it's ongoing abuse. And I think that is the path forward with this legislation, because the Mormon and the Catholic Church are extremely powerful, and I don't think they would let an abolishment of the privilege proceed because of their influence in the state legislature. But I don't know how any religious institution who's responsible for the care of the souls of children would allow ongoing abuse to occur by failing to report. And I think those type of amendments could possibly succeed. Failed last year in Arizona, but we are going to try again.
Natasha, briefly?
You know, I don't know what the path forward is. I mean, the Catholic Church has been embroiled in these sex scandals since the early 2000s. And I was involved in a documentary just a few years ago where there were still active priests. There's still priests that are in active ministry who have credible allegations of sex abuse. So, I wish I had the answer for that, but it's very shocking how pervasive this issue is within religious organizations.
And Mark, I'll give you the last word in just a sentence or two.
Yeah, briefly, I would say, sadly, the solution is ultimately for people to wake up and leave those churches if they're not protecting their children. And secondly, if they have to file civil cases against those organizations, to make them wake up and realize how critical this is. then they should do that and get some justice.
That's Mark O'Donnell. He's an advocate for survivors of sexual abuse in the Jehovah's Witness Church. Also with us, Lynn Cadigan, an attorney practicing sex abuse law, and Natasha Del Toro, host of the new Al Jazeera Fault Lines documentary, Confessions, Silence, and Child Abuse, Secrets of the Clergy. My thanks to you all. Today's producer was Michelle Harvin, and this program comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Jen White. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again tomorrow. This is 1A.
Well, this is an excellent news article that got into this, the radio broadcast. And our hopes is that this can get out to the rest of the world, that they can understand what's going on behind the doors of all these churches, the Kingdom Halls, the Watchtower, the Mormons, the Catholic Church. Is this the start of Babylon falling? Are these main churches going to hang on to child sex crimes? They're going to take their crash with child sex crimes. It seems like they want to hang on to that clergy penitent privilege. And in the U.S., there's too many of these religious bishops and stuff that are getting involved in politics. Senators, Mormons that are senators. And once they get into politics, well, they can mold the people and they can do what they want. So it's up to you. It's up to us as the people. I'm here in Canada. And my argument to the Watchtower hasn't even started yet. So I'm just getting warmed up. Well, thanks again, folks. And keep warm out. It's been cold. So put on your blankets, your sweaters. We have a cold streak just for a bit here. It's starting to warm up. But if you keep living your life with love, that brings a lot of warmth into things. Well, thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again for watching. We appreciate your comments, your dislikes, and your likes. If you would like to support the channel, just press join and buy us a coffee once a month. Until next time, keep dancing, smiling, laughing, and most of all, keep loving those around you. And have a great day.
Produced by Fixing My Faith.